Hello students, welcome to our discussion of Chapter 9, Motivation and Emotion. So let's get into this with some definitions of motivation before we go into some of the most basic and early theories of motivation, like hunger and sex and things like that. So motivation is essentially that force or energy that moves people to behave, think, or act in certain ways. So it's the thing that is required to sustain any kind of behavior. So where does that come from? That's where this field of motivation as well as emotion comes from, because emotions are tied into motivation as well. So let's talk about that. So one of the approaches, and one of the still a strong approach in the field of motivation, is the evolutionary approach, looking to instincts, things that are innate and unlearned, things that we essentially evolved over time as basic pieces that drive us to behave in certain ways. So do we behave in specific ways because of our evolutionary background, the things that were adaptive to us in the past, that kind of thing. One example of that is baby's instinct to suck on things. So I forget if in this developmental class, if in chapter 8 we talked about this, but if you touch we did talk about this reflex and instinct, that if you touch a baby's cheek, they will move their head towards whatever's touching them and try to suck on it. So it's adaptive. It helps them find a nipple and get food. So it's something that we have evolved to do that thing. So motivation, we're motivated to seek out that food, and that is learned through this evolutionary adaptation to do that. So that's where that instinct comes from. So are there other behaviors that we can explain based on any kind of motivations that we gained through evolution? So it looks for the motivations from in sex, aggression, achievement, and other behaviors, and essentially any kind of behavior. It wonders, could there be evolutionary underpinnings or evolutionary instincts that lead to those behaviors? And so we'll see some of those come up through the class today. But that's kind of the focus of the school of thought, and looking to motivations through this evolutionary lens. So drive reduction theory suggests that we have needs, that there are certain physical or biological needs that we need to have met. So when we have that physical or biological deprivation, we are then driven to reduce that deprivation. So a really good example of this is water. If you have a need, a physiological need for water, you might then have a drive to get water. So the need, again, is that physical or biological need, that thing that you, if you're deprived of, you will not be able to survive or work optimally. So the need here is water in this example. The drive is that we are aroused into a certain state because of that need. In this case, thirst. We are driven to go and find some water, and even though I wasn't feeling thirsty beforehand because I drank some water right before the lecture, I am now feeling motivated to drink some water. Well, I guess flavored water, but still water. So the need is that physical or biological deprivation, so you need water to survive. If you haven't drank water in a couple hours, you might start getting a headache, something like that. And then so you have that drive to reduce that. You go and you drink some water. Homeostasis is a big piece of this drive reduction theory. It suggests that we have a tendency physiologically to maintain a steady state of equilibrium. So we don't want to be too full of water or too thirsty. We want to have a happy medium there. And so it tries to explain a lot of different behaviors, but could that have explained my behavior to drink water just now as we're talking about it? Maybe not. So that's the point of drive reduction. Well, that's not the point of drive reduction theory. That's one criticism of drive reduction theory, that we do definitely have physiological needs. Food, water, sex, things like that can be physical needs, or we have physical drives. Anxiety might drive us to do certain things, for example. So we have certain drives that might reduce those physiological or biological needs that might have also been instinctual, depending on what it is. But it doesn't explain all behaviors, right? It probably doesn't. So you could probably think of a bunch of different examples of behaviors it might not explain. So why am I motivated when hearing a kind of notification around me to check my phone or something like that? Um, that literally just happened right now. You probably couldn't hear the notification, but I checked to make sure that my phone was on silent, so I wasn't distracted by it during the class. So another theory of motivation is the optimal arousal theory. So essentially, this is the idea that performance is best in this little green area here, around something that's moderate or arousal rather than something that's very highly arousing or very low arousal. So let's take, for example, performance in sports. Or even music. So let's say you've got a concert, or you're trying to learn a new piece of music, or you're trying to compete in a soccer game or at a track meet. The idea here is that there's an optimal level of arousal there. So if you're too anxious about it, too stressed out, if you are way over here on the arousal level, you are not going to perform as well as if you are here in this area, the optimal performance area. So whether it's music, sports, writing, doing well on a test. But if you're not aroused enough, you'll be bored and tired, you won't be engaged, you'll miss a pass in soccer or something like that. So that's a basic component of the optimal arousal theory. And your book goes into a little more detail as well. So, what are some of the biological underpinnings of some of our motivations? Well, one of the first that was investigated is hunger. And so, one thing that motivates our hunger and our wanting to eat is gastric signals. So, essentially, stomach contractions help signal hunger pains. So, when the stomach is less full, or when it's contracting to digest food, it can send hunger pains. So with this, I said this earlier today, but I feel like I'm going to mess it up right now. This word, CCK, is a hormone that helps start the digestion of food. So it is important, but it also sends the brain a message to stop eating. So it helps start digesting the food, or in the process of your body digesting the food. And it also sends a message to stop eating. So as you can see, all these little arrows here, there's a lot happening. So 1, then we get 2, some hormones being released, 3, messages to the brain, 4, and then we've got 5, you want to get some food in, that food goes into the stomach. So it's kind of a complicated process. There's a lot of steps if you break it down in that way. And a lot of it's because of these hormones. We talked about hormones when we talked about neurology and the nervous system. So most of the class we focused on the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord, and the neurotransmitters and the neurons and how quick they are to respond. For hormones, it takes a lot longer to respond because they have to fill more of the bloodstream to get the message up to like the pituitary gland in the brain to then have the brain recognize that, hey, you're eating, stop eating, you're full. So part of that goes into the blood chemistry. So there needs to be enough of the hormone levels in the blood to be able to register with your pituitary gland, for example. So glucose or blood sugar is one important component of that. So it's needed for brain functionings and other processes of cells all around the body. So you need that glucose to run and live. Insulin helps control glucose. So depending on if you're eating simple or complex carbs, will determine how much insulin your body produces. And so based on that, will change the hormone levels in your body, will change what your brain is telling you to eat or not eat. So if you're on a keto diet where you're very low carb, you're going to have a different level of insulin and your glucose will be a little different versus if you're on something like a high carb diet and eating a lot of pastas and things like that. So that'll lead to different levels of insulin in your blood chemistry. So leptin is released by fat cells. And with that, as that is released by fat cells, it tends to decrease food intake and increase metabolism overall. So the body starts burning more of the glucose and the other resources it has to burn, and the hormones that it then releases tells your brain, hey, you should probably be eating less food now. So with this, there's different parts of the brain that are important for this process too. We've mentioned the pituitary gland. That's one of the main parts, but not the only part of your brain that's connected with hormone levels in your body. So the lateral hypothalamus helps a lot with the initiation of hunger and wanting to eat, so that initial motivation to eat. The ventromedial hypothalamus, so a little bit in a different spot on the hypothalamus, helps with that cessation of hunger and eating. So that's where you get the message, and what sends the message out to, hey, you've eaten enough, you should stop eating. So a lot of that's dependent on hormone levels in your blood for getting these messages going. This is one reason people say you should eat slowly when you're trying to watch what you eat, because if you have a whole big, well, we'll talk about plate size and psychology in a second, but if you have a whole big plate, you might have already eaten more than your body actually needs to feel full. So it takes a few minutes, sometimes even as much as 15 minutes, to get those hormone levels to tell your brain, hey, you should stop eating now. So that's why maybe on Thanksgiving, for example, you eat 3 whole pumpkin pies and before, really quickly, before realizing that that was a bad idea. Not that that's ever happened to me before at all. So how do we get obese when our bodies are programmed to stop us eating? Well, one reason is what I just said. We can eat more before we get that message, and that can contribute. But with that, about 1 in 6 children is overweight or obese, and about 50% of adults, so 1 in 2, so about half of adults are overweight or obese. So how does this happen? Well, a lot of it is probably from genetic tendencies. So every individual person has a different set point. So a point where their weight will stay with no effort to adjust diet or exercise. So if they're just living without doing exercise regularly, or changing their diet, so going on a keto diet, or reducing sugar intake, or eating more, I don't know, kale or whatever. So everybody has a different biological set point where their body will kind of be at, set point is probably the best description, because homeostasis is the word I want to use, but it's not exactly accurate because you might still be out of balance. And the idea of homeostasis was that you're in balance with things. So with that being said, is your set point, your individual set point, does it have a higher concentration or a lower concentration of fat cells? Is that where your body genetically wants to be? So that's a big part of this. So genetically, some people are going to have a higher number of fat cells, as opposed to other people might have a lower number of fat cells. So a lot of that is biological, just within the genes. But some of these are psychological as well. So time and place cues. So as an example, my children pretty consistently, even if they don't know how to tell time yet, pretty much always at about the same times each day, decide that they're hungry about that same time. There's other cues around the house or things that they see that might cue them that it's about time to eat. As an example, when the sugar and fat content is high, we tend to eat a lot more. And this kind of goes into that evolutionary adaptiveness. We evolved to be able to like things like sugar and like fat, because evolutionarily it was harder to get those. So you find some nuts, or you cook some meat or something like that, it gives your body a lot more of that dense nutrients and dense fats, versus now we can get things like sugars and fats a lot. On average, people in the developed world are able to get a lot more sugars and fats. So get a Snickers bar, that's a lot more sugars and fats than our evolutionary ancestors probably had access to. So our bodies already want to eat that sugar and fat content. So it helps with marketing for Snickers. What's Snickers owned by? It doesn't matter. It helps with marketing for that brand, but for us and for our waistlines, it's not so great that we evolutionarily just really like that sugar and fat in Snickers, or Twix. Those are my favorite. Take Fives. Those are really great. Haven't had one of those for a long time. I don't see them very often in stores, but I guess I'm also trying to avoid looking for them because of these reasons. So portion size is also really interesting. So if you give 2 different people different size plates, or the same person 2 different size plates, a smaller plate versus a larger plate, they will tend to eat the entire plate, no matter what size it is. So, based on that, you find that in the U.S. we tend to eat more because our portion sizes are traditionally a lot larger. So with that, interestingly, people often eat mindlessly. They try to empty their plate. I think your book talks about, or it might have been another entry-level psych book that had a story about a research study that they did where people had different levels of soup in their bowls to study their eating habits. And so for some participants, they had just the bowl of soup. I forget how many ounces, like a little more than a cup, maybe a cup and a half of soup. So some participants had a cup and a half of soup in their bowl. They ate it. They were asked like 10 minutes later how full they felt. They rated they felt pretty full. Then they gave another participants, so another set of random participants, let's say 50, I don't remember the exact numbers here, but they gave another large number of participants the same bowl, but on the bottom of the bowl there was essentially a straw pumping new soup into the bowl. So while it was going down slowly, they were filling it up. And so some participants got even double the portion, and they ate it all. So with that, they asked those participants the same thing. I think they had 3 levels. They had like the 1.5 cups, and let's just make up the numbers, and then like 2 cups, and then 2.5 cups of soup. People would just keep eating the soup as long as there was more in the bowl. And for each of those people, they all rated their fullness as the same. It's probably the wrong word. Fullness, how full they were, as being the same. So people tend to eat mindlessly. I wish my kids would be a little more mindful when they are eating, so that they actually eat their food and they get the nutrients that they need. That's one thing I'm always worried about. So let's move on to one of the other most popular things to study in the realm of motivation is sex and sexuality. So with this, the biology of sex is a lot of the motivation for sex is centered around the hypothalamus, and you might recognize that also from a couple slides ago when we were talking about other areas. I went way too far back. Here we go. Hypothalamus, important for motivation for eating. Hypothalamus, important for the motivation for sex as well. So not just those, it's important in motivation for a lot of things. As we've talked about, neural networks do a lot of different things. So the neurons in the hypothalamus, they're involved in a lot of different aspects of motivation. Hunger, sex. With that, it connects to the limbic system, the cerebral cortex, so the outside more wrinkly part of the brain. If you remember, that's the cerebral cortex. The limbic system is heavily involved in erection in men and orgasm in women as well. So all important components of sex. So kind of the path that we take both neurologically and biologically through sex is, first you have neurotransmitters and sex hormones that produce sexual feelings, or like the sexual urges, that desire, and then you have that sexual arousal. So with that, you then have that desire to engage in sexual behavior. Then you might engage in sexual behavior. Then you get that rewarding sensation with lots of dopamine from the acts of sex as well as orgasm. And then after that, feelings of calm and relief. And at that point, you generally get a lot of oxytocin as well. So that's kind of neurologically and biologically what's happening, kind of those steps there. So you get those first neurotransmitters and sex hormones leading to feelings of arousal, leading to you wanting to engage in sex. Then you might be engaging in sex. Then you get those rewarding sensations. And then after orgasm especially, you get those feelings of calm and relief with lots of oxytocin. That's an important neurotransmitter as well. So with this, the human sexual response pattern during so my screen just cut out. Hopefully it was still recording and it didn't actually cut out. I'll try to remember to come back and check. So this is during the acts of sex, so that excitement, that arousal, can last from minutes to even hours. So the plateau is that increased pulse and blood pressure during acts of sex, and then the orgasm is defined as the explosive discharge of neuromuscular tension. So with that, you've got that intense stress up to it, and then quick relaxation after it. Generally, the orgasm itself lasts only about 3 to 15 seconds. And then you have the resolution after that, the more calm time where there's lots of oxytocin. It's also called the male refractory period, which is a time when a male can't have another orgasm for a span of time, versus women, that time essentially, depending on the person, for male versus female, females tend to not have anything like a refractory period. So with this, there are cognitive factors in our motivation for sex too. So these are all related to the biological factors, these neurotransmitters and sexual arousal leading to the behaviors, and all these slides. We also have cognitive factors in our motivation to engage in sex. So some of these are sexual scripts, which we've talked about scripts a couple times in relation to other topics. So the last one that I think we talked about was in the chapter on social psychology. We have social scripts of how people should behave in certain situations. Similarly, we have these kind of expectations of how people should behave in a sexual encounter or leading up to a sexual encounter, as well as after a sexual encounter. So a lot of this is influenced by media, by things that you hear from other people, and essentially social learning of what you should expect before, during, and after sex. So with this, the themes that are involved in these sexual scripts often involve love or maybe conquest, recreation. All of these could be part of any individual's sexual script and what they're expecting from sex. So with that, cognitive factors in sex also is the interpretation of the event. So both before and after and during. So what is your interpretation of what's going on? Does it match your script? Do you feel positive or negative? Your thoughts about the person you're with as well. And then sensory triggers. So so you have your sensations and perceptions. Are you more engaged or aroused by touch or visual inputs and sensations and perceptions? So these all influence your motivations during sex. So with this, cultural factors also have an influence, which isn't too surprising. So this is one of the ecological systems theory. So Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory, we see an individual within their microsystem, those people they interact with day in and day out, their exosystem, the people around them in their community essentially, and then the macrosystem, the ideas of the culture around them. So those cultural values are going to impact people's ideas, their immediate family's ideas, and that will lead to how they understand sexual scripts. So what are their sexual scripts are heavily influenced by the impact of that culture, as well as immediately that microsystem, but it's all kind of funneling down in this model. So with that, there are cultural rules around sex. What is appropriate, what is inappropriate. Some cultures tend to have more sex on average, some cultures tend to have less sex on average. So a lot of that will go into what you expect from a relationship, from the sex itself, what's going to happen before, what's going to happen after. So that will go into your cognitive factors and influence the biological factors. So what are you then aroused by? What makes those neurotransmitters start going? So with that, let's talk specifically about adolescent sexuality. We didn't get a lot of time to talk about this during the chapter on development, but it is a really relevant part of human experience. So it is really difficult to study adolescent sexuality. So think about just for a minute, why might it be difficult to study adolescent sexuality? So one of the main reasons, hopefully you thought of this, is that adolescents tend to lie about their sexual behaviors. So whether they are overestimating their sexual behaviors or underestimating. So an adolescent who feels maybe ashamed or worried about reporting their sexual behaviors or what they are doing, they might not report what their actual behavior is, versus there are other adolescents who might think it's it makes them seem cool to act like they're having more sex or more often or doing more different things. So we get the same problem when talking to adolescents about their behavior around drugs as well. So adolescents either lie, well, I guess both are a lie. They lie either that they're doing a lot more drugs or having a lot more sex, or a lot less drugs or a lot less sex than they actually are. So it's difficult. So what can be done to fix that problem? So think to way back to our chapters 1 and 2 when we were talking about research methods. How could you try to fix this? How could you try to get good and accurate data about adolescent sexuality, what they are actually doing, their actual behaviors? So methods wise, and again, this is stretching back quite a few chapters. So think about how could you fix this problem and get real good data from adolescents on their sexuality. So there's a bunch of different things that you can do. Hopefully you thought of a few. Some of the most commonly tried are making sure it's anonymous. Like whatever study you're doing, whatever survey you're doing, making sure it's anonymous and the students understand and believe and know that it's anonymous. So usually, I say students because usually when you're accessing adolescent samples, it's in like a school type of setting. So they usually are students. With that, you want to make sure that they know their parents aren't going to see the results, their teachers, their administrators. It's not going to go to police, especially in regards to drug behavior. So to get an accurate assessment, you need to make them understand that it is going to be anonymous. And you do actually have to make it anonymous. Can't just say it's going to be and then not have it. That's very unethical. Other things that you can do is do things like lie scales. So there are certain kinds of pro-social or antisocial things that people will tend to say, oh, I definitely don't do that. So for example, if you ever see on, well, maybe I shouldn't tell you that much specifics. Lie scales might ask a question something like, have you ever told a lie to someone? And I would assume everybody has told some sort of lie to someone. So if you see participants saying, absolutely not, I have never told a lie, I've never done this thing, I always do this thing, you can be a little more sure that they're lying about that. And if they are, you might just throw out their data on their sexuality and drug questions. So that's another way to do it. Another thing to do is track their sexual behaviors over time. So something like a longitudinal study. So asking them, in the last 3 months, how many times have you done X, Y, and Z? In the last 6 months, how many times have you done X, Y, and Z? So take that and then 3 months later ask them the same in the last 3 months, in the last 6 months, and then you can look and say, okay, so it looks like they were overestimating last 3 months, and then maybe they're getting more accurate. But again, that's kind of a lot of statistical analysis there, but kind of getting them to re-report things that they've reported before and compare them up. And then if they don't line up, you could just throw out that data, because it's like, when were they being truthful, this time or the last time? So that's another way. So for that, I'd say that beforehand to give you the caveat that some of this data, while it should be reliable and we see similar things with lots of different samples of adolescents tend to lie about their sexual behaviors. So hopefully this is reliable data. It might be slightly off, but hopefully we get better data as time goes on. But again, a lot of this data is kind of replicated in a bunch of different samples. So the average age of sexual initiation is 16. And then there's usually about 1 year between a first and second sexual behavior for any one individual. So if they first have a sexual encounter at 16, the next one's probably not till that individual is about 17. So with that, adolescents and emerging adults also seem to be having less sex on average than previous generations. So here's one paper that reports that. If you're interested in reasons behind that, go ahead and look into it. I wonder if perhaps older research didn't do as good of a job getting at accurate numbers, but I'm sure that doesn't account for the entirety of that difference. So, timing of specific sexual behaviors. So, oral sex rates have increased among younger people. So, with that, and that is compared to previous generations, oral sex rates have increased. So, why is that? Why might that be? Well, one is that pregnancy is really unlikely and really impossible if you're only doing oral sex, right? So, with that though, if you're doing oral sex, some participants might also be doing other sex acts as well. But if oral sex is the only thing, then the adolescents feel a little more comfortable with that for a couple other reasons that we'll see in a minute. So with that, if someone's only doing oral sex, they tend to be having vaginal sex within about 6 months after on average. So again, these are averages. Any individual, it might be like the day after or something like that, or at the same time, or another, it's a couple of years after, but these are average numbers. So with that, even with oral sex, STIs are still a risk, including things like herpes and chlamydia. So it's one of the main reasons adolescents are engaging in more oral sex is to avoid that risk of pregnancy, they're not always taking the precautions that they need to prevent STIs. So with this, adolescents who only engage in oral sex do report increased pleasure as opposed to their peers that are not engaging in only oral sex. They feel more good about themselves and less conflict with parents. One interesting finding is this less conflict with parents seems to be coming from the fact that adolescents don't tend to see oral sex as sex. And so a parent says, hey, I can't imagine a parent asking the question this directly, but maybe they do. Maybe could be a good thing, especially if they have that communication between them. Although if they have the communication between them, the adolescent probably wouldn't be lying. Anyway, so if a parent says, hey, are you having sex? The adolescent, if they don't feel like oral sex is sex, they can, as they feel honestly, say no, and then there's less conflict with parents. So it seems like a lot of the reason behind it is that, which is interesting. So with that, there are a lot of risk factors in adolescent sexuality that we'll just cover really briefly. So many adolescents, we've talked about how adolescents, especially in early adolescence, the amygdala is finishing its myelination, and so they're feeling new emotions, stronger, more emotions than they have before in their life, and they still don't have the prefrontal cortex completely myelinated, so they still don't necessarily have the emotion regulation and the planning and goal orientation and forethought that they will as a adult that's about 25 or so. So many adolescents aren't, especially earlier adolescents, are not emotionally prepared to handle sexual experiences and the feelings that they might have from them. So this is especially true of early adolescents. These risk factors are definitely higher risk for earlier in adolescence. So risks of early sexual experience for adolescents earlier than 14 is also drug use. So those are highly correlated. So early sexual experience as well as drug use. Wrong way. Delinquency and school problems for these adolescents, that's really highly correlated. So it's not necessarily that one is causing the other, but they're very highly related. We tend to see student or adolescents that are engaging in sex before the age of 14 also tend to have a higher probability or chance of having delinquency and school problems. Also, this is also bad. I was going to say worse, but depending on the kind of delinquency, let's not make value judgments here about whether never mind. Sexual assault, forced sex, and rape are also highly correlated, generally as victims, but also as perpetrators. So with that, that's obviously a really high risk factor. That kind of trauma can be really problematic. So also a higher risk of not using a condom and a higher risk of pregnancy. So there is probably a causal relation between the pregnancy one and the not using a condom, as well as sexual assault, for sex, and rape. But for the drug use and delinquency, those are highly correlated. I'm not actually sure if there is causal data between the last three. I need to go and review papers and chapters on these things again. So being low SES and is one additional risk factor, as well as living in an inner city is an additional risk factor. So if you have kind of this whole combination, being low SES in inner cities, having an early sexual experience at, say, the age of 13, as well as delinquent in school, all those risk factors really combine, like we were talking in the developmental cascade model, to tend to lead towards more negative outcomes. So protecting adolescents from these kinds of negative outcomes, these kinds of risks, is a big thing that psychologists and researchers, health practitioners, parents oftentimes want to help protect young people from. So with that, family context also has an impact. So the parental hostility is really correlated with early sexual activity, as well as adolescents early on having multiple sexual partners. Having older siblings who are also sexually active is highly correlated with earlier sexual activity. Single parent homes, especially for girls, is highly correlated with early sexual activity. And these are, again, early sexual activity in adolescence is correlated with all these risks. So having deviant peers in early adolescence is also correlated to early sexual activity. Low or weak self-regulation, which, as we talked about, is pretty common in adolescence, especially in early adolescence. They don't have the full use of their prefrontal cortex that they will have a decade later. So they have less self-regulation than they will in the future, but they also might have less regulation than their peers at their same age. So if you have that combination of factors, it leads you to even higher risks of these problems. Oh, wrong way. Also impulsiveness. Interestingly, even for adolescents with higher or lower self-regulation, the first sexual experience is often impulsive. And this makes a lot of sense when you think about the motivation and emotion that we're talking about. So if they're getting that motivation from these basic biological drives, maybe it's, let's say, two 15-year-olds, they haven't had any sexual experience before, they're together, they are in a space where they're able to, they have time or something like that, and they have those hormones will lead to that sexual arousal, and they don't have necessarily the self-regulation to stop those behaviors. This is why many first sexual experiences, especially in earlier adolescence, are often really impulsive. They're highly hormonally caused and highly emotionally caused. And with that, that's also a risk factor in and of itself, because when these behaviors are being driven solely by these motivations of those hormones, it makes it a lot less likely that these adolescents are going to be using contraception. This is also another reason why it's not uncommon for females who are having sex for the first time to get pregnant, because oftentimes those hormones are stronger during a period where they're fertile. So if they're not using contraception, the female is more fertile, they're having sex, a higher probability that they're going to get pregnant. So this is why sex education and good sex education is important. And we're going to cover that in just a minute, but I don't think it's the next slide. Yes, first we're covering protective factors. So we've been talking about risk factors, all this negative stuff, bad, these things are bad, combinations are worse. So let's talk about what things can support or protect, be protective factors, so that the chance of reaching those negative outcomes is lower. Well, one big one is parental warmth and support. From this as well, parental monitoring, family connectedness, having open communication from members of the family. This is all really important as a protective factor, so that even if some of these risk factors exist, it might negate those risk factors. So if you have parental warmth and support, you have family connectedness, you have the parents communicating with the adolescents, and the adolescents, this is important too, the adolescents also communicating with the parents about their sexuality. That is a huge protective factor, so that adolescents know some of these risks, know that they have someone that's supportive of them. Parent monitoring is really important as well. So parent monitoring is is essential. I mean, you could think of like a baby monitor. You're kind of watching over the baby to make sure it's safe. Parent monitoring for adolescents is similar in some ways. You're probably not watching them with a camera in their room at that point anymore. I would think. But you are still checking up on them, seeing how they're doing, in school with their friends, what kind of troubles are they having, how they're doing in school, how are they doing in jobs or with relationships. So being aware of what's going on in their lives. So the positive high school climate actually has a lot of positive correlations. So both in academics, obviously, but as well as other socio-emotional aspects. So friendships tend to be more positive. There tends to be less bullying when there is a positive school climate. Higher academic achievement is also a protective factor. And higher or stronger self-regulation, maybe not surprising, for those adolescents who are higher than average on their self-regulation. They tend not to be engaging in earlier sexual behaviors, or they're using contraception, things like that. Internalized pro-social norms is interestingly a protective factor as well as spirituality can be a protective factor. So again, these protective factors are kind of like the opposite of risk factors. Risk factors are those things that might tend to make you go towards possible negative future outcomes because of behaviors and the context you might find yourself in. Protective factors are those things that would kind of bump you more towards positive outcomes. They can negate some of the risk factors and vice versa as well. Risk factors can negate some of the positive factors too. So they can kind of cancel each other out. Like if you had one protective factor, one risk factor, they might cancel each other out and you're kind of at the neutral point there. So here we go. Let's talk about comprehensive sex education and family planning. So first let's get an understanding of what is comprehensive sex education. And we'll get to this video last.
In today's changing world, growing up isn't always easy. Imagine being without accurate information and reliable skills as you navigate the journey to adulthood. Do myths end up masquerading as reality? Do peers, television and the internet stand in for reliable resources and information from caring qualified adults? Fortunately, comprehensive sexuality education, or CSE, can make this journey easier, more certain and healthier for many young people around the world. You may know CSE as life skills education, family life education, or HIV prevention education. No matter what the name, CSE aims to ensure that all young people develop the knowledge and skills to make conscious, healthy and responsible choices about relationships and sexuality. CSE has always been a part of many cultures. Often family members taught young people about puberty, sex and relationships. Now, as societies change, the responsibility is increasingly shared with health workers, teachers and schools. CSE in schools is led by trained teachers and professionals. It focuses on the development of practical skills and knowledge that is scientifically accurate and comprehensive. CSE starts in primary school with age-appropriate content and builds on topics gradually as the child grows older and develops. It looks at human development throughout every phase of life, including physical, psychological, social, and spiritual dimensions. CSE gives young people a chance to think critically about gender and about their role in their culture and society. It teaches about tolerance, non-violence, respect, equality, and empathy. CSE shapes values, attitudes, and decisions about relationships, including healthy sexual relationships when the time comes. With this knowledge and these life skills, it's easier for young people to decide if, when, and with whom to have sex, and how to say no if that's not what they want. It's a fact. All the evidence shows that good quality CSE helps young people to delay their first sexual experience. It also helps prevent HIV, sexually transmitted infections, and unintended pregnancy. Young people deserve to be healthy, happy, and to realize their fullest potential. They deserve to grow up in a world with CSE, a much less scary, less confusing, and less harmful place than a world without it. As leaders, teachers and parents, we have the responsibility to act now, so comprehensive sexuality education is part of every young person's journey to adulthood, no matter where in the world they live.
Alright, so that video packed a lot in it about what comprehensive sex education is. So one of the big key points that I want to emphasize here, I might not be able to find the spot, is that comprehensive sex education aims to look at and teach young people skills at every point in their development that is related to sex education. So, as an example, these kids look very small, maybe even a kindergarten or preschool class or something like that. At that level, a comprehensive sex education program would probably be called a socio-emotional education program, something like that. So it would be teaching things like empathy, respect, kindness. So you're not going to be talking with kindergartners about sex acts or how to use a condom. For a preschool classroom or a kindergarten or first grade, you're going to be talking about, hey, we share with each other, we're nice to each other, we're kind to each other. If someone says no, they don't want to play, that's okay. Like, we respect their decisions, being respectful, being empathetic, being responsible. Those are the kind of cores that you'll be learning at that age point, because that's age-appropriate learning, relevant for life skills, socio-emotional skills. And how it refers to, as they grow older, they're given more and more information to help them develop in a healthy way socio-emotionally. So those same basic skills of empathy, respect, responsibility are going to come into play in, say, middle school or high school, when they're actually learning about sexually transmitted illnesses, HIV, using contraceptives. At that point, they'll already know, hopefully, the idea here is that hopefully they'll already know about being empathetic, being kind, being respectful, being responsible, and asking for permission, asking for consent, things like that. So by that time, they're already familiar with these concepts, and these concepts are now just applied specifically to sexual behaviors. So that's kind of how this is growing with the young people. And it is comprehensive in the sense that it's trying to get them a full picture of what's happening in puberty, what might be happening socio-emotionally, and how to be safe as well if they do decide to engage in sex. Educating them about sexual scripts and that about consent, things like that. That's all part of comprehensive sex education. So let's look at some examples of how you might actually teach it. I mentioned a couple examples now. Most of this focuses on a middle school, I believe, but some of it also shows how you, or talks about how you might teach comprehensive sex education to younger children as well.
Aspects of one's sexuality. So parents are doing the primary work by of one's sexuality. So parents are doing the primary work by communicating their values.
Could you tell me about sex?
About sex.
And then teachers and other professionals are providing young people with the information they need and the opportunity and spaces they need to discuss those things with their peers. Sex education in kindergarten should focus on empathy and narrating emotional experiences. Fidel, when are you glad? What makes you glad?
Doing cartwheels?
Doing cartwheels makes you glad. Sex education in elementary school should be an extension of that and focus on how we treat each other and that it matters. We're going to get explicit really quickly. We're going to talk about anatomy. You ready for that? Okay. Sex education in middle school should include puberty education that is medically accurate and comes from credible resources, as well as how that information can be applied to the social dynamics that they're experiencing. Sex education in high school should include additional information about safe sexuality practices and also continued practice on how to apply that information to the complexities of social dynamics. So
I think that gives a better idea of where you're going step by step with this socio-emotional education, with this comprehensive sex education, is you're starting with these basic core concepts of empathy, kindness, respect, how we treat each other, building on that in other contexts in elementary school. In middle school, you're learning about the body, physically what's happening during puberty, which is relevant because that's a time when a lot of people are going to be starting puberty. Then in high school, it's very important, especially earlier on in high school, to get the sex education of what do you do in relationships, what kind of scripts are acceptable and not, as well as safe sex practices. So you might have watched that video of that kindergarten classroom and said, this doesn't look at all like sex education. And it's really not supposed to. It's supposed to be building those skills that will later be relevant in sexual interactions, in dating relationships with peers and whatnot. So that's what they're talking about, age appropriate for these time periods. So yeah, hopefully that gives you a lot clearer picture. Let's finish this up to see if there's any other relevant points.
Students have the opportunity in a school setting to talk about these issues, learn about them with the very people who they may be exploring those things with. And that's something that you can't really create in your home.
So, comprehensive sex education. This video is really good with, considering we just watched two videos, looking at the comparison between what's really common in the US is abstinence-only sex education, and comprehensive sex education is only now really just gaining traction in a lot of places across the US. But comprehensive sex education, as opposed to abstinence-only sex education, there's a lot of research actually out there about it and comparing the outcomes, like are there more pregnancies with one versus the other? Are there higher rates of STIs with one or the other? And what we see from those kinds of numbers is that comprehensive sex education is the most effective. So this is worldwide. So starting early on in kindergarten, elementary school, up to middle school and high school, giving age-appropriate content relevant to sexual interactions to help people behave in appropriate ways so that they can be respectful of one another is one of the best things to do to prevent things like unwanted pregnancies, STIs, and other of these risky behaviors that we were talking about. It's one of those other things that might be considered a protective factor. So feel free to watch this one. It's linked in the slides. Considering we've just watched a couple videos right now, I won't watch it because basically the key takeaway, it talks about a lot more specific research in that video, but you can also do this as, say, a question paper if you'd like. Essentially, comprehensive sex education is the best. Abstinence only is not very good. So, yeah. In a general classroom setting, I would ask students, like, how many students did an abstinence only versus a comprehensive sex education program? And so here in Utah, what I've seen is that a majority that did sex education here in Utah tended to have abstinence only sex education. I had my sex education, it was a health class in high school and essentially a small course, like a week or two long course in, I think, 7th or 8th grade, so in middle school, and it was abstinence only focused. So yeah, definitely watch that video or read some extra research. Comprehensive sex education is definitely a better option. So let's talk about sexual minority attitudes and behaviors. So with this, sexual orientation, let's define that. That's the direction of erotic interest. So who are you interested in? So with that, usually attraction to same-sex or and same-sex behavior or identifying as LGBTQ+ occurs in adolescence. So with that, it does seem like it might happen in emerging adulthood as well. It's not uncommon to see that in emerging adulthood. So with that, there in adolescence specifically, there tends to be a lot of testing out sexual experiences, but there doesn't seem to be too many relationships on average for people that are LGBTQ plus in adolescence. There seems to be more testing out sexual experiences, but then later in emerging adulthood, there seems to be more relationships. A lot of this is probably just because of the number of fish in the sea, essentially. If you're in a high school, my graduating class was small. It was what, like 150 or 200 students. So my high school was fairly small. So with that, there would be fewer potential partners for anyone who's LGBTQ plus in that kind of context. Versus in emerging adulthood, it's probably easier to find more potential partners and engage in relationships than it would be in, say, a high school type of setting. So with that, the total percentage of people who are LGBTQ plus in the world is somewhere between 3 and 7%. It really depends on the study you look at. I've even seen some studies suggest as high as 10% of the population, but there's a lot of repeated findings. So it seems like that about the 5% number is pretty reliable across worldwide. So in all countries and cultures. So with that, what are the developmental pathways for sexual minority adolescents? So researchers have investigated the development of sexual interest and orientation from genetics, biology, so hormones, brain chemistry, the structure of the brain, things like that, as well as the cognitive, environmental, and social factors that go into developing an orientation. So with that, it seems like there might be a critical period of influence hormonally for sexual orientation in the 2nd to 5th month after conception. So this is still in utero, this is still before birth, that there seems to be a critical period with certain hormone levels might partially explain or lead to sexual orientations, but it doesn't explain it completely. Similar to twin studies, if it had an enormous effect, all twins of any sexual orientation, their identical twin, or in this case, fraternal twin as well, would have the same or similar sexual orientation. And we don't see that being the case. So another thing that's looked at for hormones is giving gay men more male hormones made no change or makes no change to sexual orientation. It does increase their sex drives though. So when they have those hormones, that sexual arousal tends to be higher. So, I imagine that might not have been what the researchers might have been investigating at that time. I forget what year this study was done or these studies were done, but there was, I'd say like the 80s or so. So I wonder if they suspected they might be able to turn gay men straight and realized, oh, we had not the result we were intending with that. But yeah, interesting to know that those hormones don't seem to change anything at that point, but maybe a critical period in prenatal development. So with genetics and twin studies, I mentioned that a minute ago. Again, a identical twin is essentially the same genetic match to each other. So we talked about epigenetics, that different aspects of the environment might change how proteins read genetic material and then tell the cells to do different things. So with that being said, there obviously can be epigenetic differences between twins, but their genetic code is the same. So for men, about 35% of the variation in sexual orientation and about 19% of the variation in women is attributed to genetics. So to put that in another way that might make it a little more easy to understand, so if you've got two twin men, one is gay, about 35% of the time the twin is also gay. So that goes to show that it's not entirely genetic. So there is clearly, though, a genetic component there. That is, when we look at 35% as opposed to 5% of the general population, that's clearly some sort of genetic component there that's impacting that. So, what about environmental and social factors? Well, many times the attraction to someone of the same sex or both genders starts in childhood. So interestingly, this is actually when normative development wise, that's when sexual attraction starts to develop, is in childhood. So for someone who will be straight, who will be gay, in childhood, they're starting to develop that sexual attraction. That's just the normative time for that to start to develop. And so some of your social interactions might have an impact on that. So with this, it may also start in adolescence and be really abrupt for some people as well. That's not uncommon for anyone, really. So with this, early reinforcement and experiences with same versus opposite sex can foster or hinder attractions to members of opposite or same sex. So that's some of that social interaction. You might have that genetic, a little bit higher genetic predisposition to be LGBTQ+, and then maybe you're reinforced in those behaviors, or maybe it's not fostered, it's hindered. So depending, you can think of this again in that developmental cascade model. There's many, many factors that lead someone to be anywhere on the spectrum of sexuality, right? So, one key thing that I like to get across to students in this kind of class is this more nuanced view of sexual orientation and how we develop our sexual orientation. So like I mentioned earlier on in childhood, we have, that's when pretty much everybody, it might happen later on in adolescence, on average, most people are starting to develop a sexual attraction in childhood. And then social factors, the genetic factors or the hormone factors from even before you were born also impact that. So this cascade is already on its way to somewhere on that spectrum, right? And then how you interact and who you interact with is also going to influence it. So let's watch this good video that really describes in a lot more scientifically accurate way how our sexual orientations develop over time. So let's watch that now. We'll actually watch it at normal speed, just because since you're watching it on YouTube as well, you can speed up through my part as well as this part, but if I record it at accelerated speed, then you're a little more limited in your options there. So, oh yeah, this one was actually done in Salt Lake City.
True or false? Sexual orientation is something you're born with. Chances are that if you support LGBT rights,
Well, it is going very slow on my end. So if I remember right, Dr. Diamond is from the University of Utah. I'm not sure if she is still there. Let's see if I can make my computer run a little faster. It's doing very little comparatively. So it's also very quiet, this video. So hopefully you can hear this. If you can't, and if the video is stuttering really poorly, the link is in the slides. Maybe just click in it in your slides, watch it on directly on your own. But let's see if we can get this to work better.
true or false? Sexual orientation is something you're born with. Chances are that if you support LGBT rights, you said true. Surveys have found that people who view sexual orientation as an innate trait, like eye color,
Okay, let's try this one more time.
true or false? Sexual orientation is something you're born with. Chances are that if you support LGBT rights, you said true. Surveys have found that people who view sexual orientation as an innate trait, like eye color, tend to be more supportive of LGBT rights. Now, why is that? When asked, folks typically say, well, it's just wrong to discriminate against someone for how they're born. It's like ethnic discrimination. Makes sense. So for years, the Born That Way argument has been used to promote LGBT equality. Lady Gaga's song, Born That Way, even became an unofficial anthem of the gay community. But there are three problems with the Born That Way argument. First, it's not scientifically accurate. Second, it's not legally necessary. But third, and most important, it's actually unjust. And it's time to retire that argument for LGBT equality. Now, my passion for this issue stems from my own research on sexual orientation. Over 20 years ago, I started a study tracking over time 100 women with different sexual identities. And over the years, I was frankly surprised by some of the changes that they went through. Some of the lesbians ended up involved with men. Some of the heterosexual women ended up getting involved with women. And when these sorts of things would happen, women would say to me that they thought there must be something wrong with them, since their experiences didn't fit the conventional wisdom that sexual orientation is fixed at birth. So that brings us to the first problem with the Born That Way argument, that it's not scientifically accurate. Now, sexual orientation does often express itself very early and very consistently. But lots of times it doesn't. And it breaks my heart when I hear people express distrust of LGBT individuals who came out late in life, for example, after a heterosexual marriage. People will say things like, how could they not have known all this time? Are they sure that they're really gay? Just imagine how it feels to hear that from someone that you just came out to. But the plain truth is that gender and sexual development show a lot more variability than most people realize. And that variability often leads to change over time in sexual attractions. National and international studies conducted by researchers at Cornell, the Harvard School of Public Health, the University of Virginia, and many others have collectively tracked tens of thousands of individuals for 5, 10, 15 years. And guess what? Sexual attractions show a fair amount of fluidity. Some individuals start out exclusively attracted to one gender, and over time they find themselves attracted to both genders, or vice versa. Some bisexual individuals shift from being more drawn to one gender to being more drawn to the other. Now, what does this fluidity tell us about the innateness of sexual orientation? Nothing. Nothing at all. Because they're completely unrelated. There is, to be sure, strong evidence for genetic contributions to sexual orientation, but those contributions do not cement your entire sexual lifespan from birth. What they do is push its development in a certain direction. If sexuality were totally locked down by genes, well then if you had two identical twins and one twin was gay, the other twin would be gay 100% of the time because they had the same genes. But in reality, twin studies have found that if you have two identical twins and one twin is gay, the other twin is gay 30 to 40% of the time. Now, that is way higher than you would expect by chance alone, so it is definite evidence that your genes influence your sexual orientation. But your genes do not provide the last word on every sexual feeling you're ever going to have. Now, before moving on, I want to make one thing crystal clear. The fact that sexuality can be fluid does not mean that therapists can cure individuals of same-sex attractions. That's sometimes called conversion therapy, and study after study has shown that it does not work, and it does immense psychological damage, increasing rates of depression, anxiety, suicide attempts. That's why conversion therapy has been discredited by all of these major medical and psychological associations, and it's why all of these former practitioners of conversion therapy have not only shut their own doors, but have publicly apologized to the LGBT community and have joined legal efforts to ban the use of conversion therapy with children and adolescents.
So I hope from this you can see a lot of the commonalities in development overall from previous chapters coming out here as well. So while there is a strong genetic component, and also hopefully you could hear that video. If not, please do watch it on your own. There's a lot of points that she makes that I really do hope you heard. I don't know why it was so quiet this time I was listening to it. But there is a strong genetic component to that sexual orientation that we have, but it's also fluid a lot more than we generally thought, even a couple decades ago, throughout adulthood. So with that, what that means is that, just like we've been talking, developmental cascades model, so there are different aspects like your genetics that might kind of push you towards a specific sexual orientation, or your social environment, who you interacted with, how you interacted with people as a child, also kind of could have pushed you or pulled you in a specific way. So that as an adult, you might find, or let's say as an adolescent at 18, you might find that your sexual orientation is something, and then over the next 20 years, it might even still shift a little bit to be more one way or another way. So sexual orientation is impacted by a lot of different biological factors, psychological factors, and socio-emotional factors, and cultural factors as well, all impacting the development and that change over time of sexual orientation. So again, the final point that she made there is that this does not mean that you can cure sexual orientation. Conversion therapy, that's bad, harmful, not cool. So making that clear. But I do like to give students who are in the psychology class a more detailed view of what's happening with people in their development. We have a clear idea of the development of children to adolescents to adults to late adulthood. We talked a lot about how late adults have greater cognitive capacities than we realized decades ago. So I hope this is another piece of information that you'll have in your mind going forward, understanding that while born that way, obviously for any individual person who's LGBTQ+, any person at all with their sexual orientation might feel that they've just always been that way. So them saying, hey, I feel like I was born that way, I'm not saying that's invalid. That's totally valid, because that's the way they felt their whole life. Then that makes perfect sense based on the research. I'm saying that the development of that sexual orientation was not just exclusively genetic for these reasons. It's a lot more complicated and a lot more interesting, and it still can change over time, which I mean, maybe it's because I'm a developmental psychologist. I find that fascinating, this change over time that people make, and how people change over time, and what impacts that change over time. Those are the things that are really interesting to me about it. So hopefully you've got a better, more scientific, accurate view of how sexual orientations are developed. And again, I really do hope you could hear that. I'll go through and watch this afterwards before putting it on YouTube, and if I think it's too quiet, I'll just cut in that video, splice it. That'll take a longer time. I hope it I hope it recorded the audio well enough. So some things orientation is not influenced by based on research. So being reared by a gay parent doesn't seem to have a higher or lower likelihood of having that child turn out to be gay. Parenting style doesn't seem to have a huge impact to like a more authoritarian versus more authoritative. Doesn't seem to have a higher correlation with any kind of orientation. Childhood sexual experimentation is also not very highly correlated with sexual orientation in adolescence and adulthood. Orientation is influenced by, like I mentioned, genetics, hormones, psychological factors, social factors, sociocultural factors. So there's a lot that goes into the development of a lot of things, and that includes sexual orientations. All right, so let's talk about families who are gay and lesbian. So with that, they are less likely to have children. Children of gay couples also don't seem to show any significant differences from other children in things like delinquency rates, school, academic achievement. That's the words I'm trying to look for. Academic achievement, delinquency, socio-emotional health. So it seems that children of gay couples are the same as children of other couples as well. They don't seem to be doing better or worse on these kinds of things that we generally look at as markers of, like, is this a healthy child? So let's talk a little bit about other aspects of motivation, other theories behind motivation and emotion. I know that was a long portion on sex and sexual motivation and then sexual orientation, but it is a big part of human experience. And I don't feel like we covered it enough in our chapter on adolescence and lifespan development. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we've mentioned it a couple times. This comes from the humanistic psychology field. So with this, it has a sequence, it's a hierarchy. Essentially, you've got at the top those things, self-actualization, that's our own motivation to develop to our own human fullest potential. So me, myself, what is my fullest potential? What do I want to do? There's a lot of agency there. But a big key of Maslow's hierarchy is that you need to meet the basic needs before going on to those next needs. So physiological, safety needs, love and belongingness, esteem, and then self-actualization. If you don't have those physiological or safety needs met, Maslow suggests that you can't get to that point of self-actualization. And we've mentioned a few times that that's not exactly true, that you can have esteem needs met or love and belongingness, or even do things that you feel are important to yourself as a person, that you're becoming the person you want to be, even if you don't have your physiological or safety needs met. So a person who's homeless, for example, that need for a home does not preclude having esteem needs or love and belongingness or self-actualization. Can it make it harder? Yes, it's a huge risk factor, but it doesn't preclude that positive of self-actualization. So another one that's very popular and relevant today is self-determination theory. So with this, self-determination, we're only going to cover it really briefly. It's the idea that humans have three basic needs. One of those needs is for competence, another one is for relatedness, and another one is for autonomy. So what is competence? Competence is our own self-efficacy, and we've talked about that before, that this is knowing that we can accomplish things. So I think the examples I gave in class another time were, I don't have very high self-efficacy in my self for learning a new language. I like my own feeling that I can do well there is pretty low. My self-efficacy for doing music and learning to play music or getting better at, say, the guitar is higher. I've got a higher self-efficacy in that. I've got pretty high self-efficacy in my ability to do research. So self-efficacy is about your own competence. Do you think you can do things in whatever specific kind of sphere? So if you think you can do really well at tennis, or if you think you can do really well at writing, or if you think you can do really well at any other specific thing, that's what self-efficacy is. So that's mastery, and you expect to succeed. So we have that need for being competent with things, and that might be part of our motivation to do certain things. So if you feel like you can do well with writing, you might be more likely to be motivated to write. Relatedness. We also have a need to have warm relations with others, a need to belong. So this might lead us to seek out friends, seek out a close group of friends, seek out a big group of friends, seek out partners, have a family, have children. So that might be related to our motivation to be related to one another. And so you might also see how that might be. My cat just scratched my hand. It thought I was playing with it while I was waving my hands around. It scared me. I will talk about emotion in a little bit. I'll try to remember to bring this up as an example for emotion. That was scary. All of a sudden, I've got a cat paw trying to grab my hand. Anyway, relatedness, relationships, need to belong, might come from evolution as well. Humans do really well when we're in groups and support each other, those kinds of things. Autonomy is that we also have a need for independence and self-reliance, like that we want to do things ourselves. This is also, you see, highly correlated with competence. So we want to be able to independently do things, we want to master things, we want to have self-efficacy and do things, but we also want to be related and have relationships with other people. So all those things together might lead you to be motivated. So these are essentially basic needs that are driving us to do things. You think of needs as like we're instinctually driven to do these three things: be competent, related, autonomous. You might think back to like Freud's ideas of the id driving you to do things. Self-determination theory is very different than that. It's saying, hey, we have these needs for competence, relatedness, autonomy, and that might influence your motivation to learn a new language or play an instrument or get your degree or write a book or something like that. So intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic is that organism's needs plus the enjoyability. So what do they need? What do they enjoy to do? What do they want to do? And it's really key to achievement. So if you can help someone gain that intrinsic motivation, one important way to do that is helping them gain self-efficacy and mastery in something, as well as being related with others around that same thing. So playing music in a group, for example, might build on that competence and relatedness. So those are really key for people reaching their goals. Extrinsic motivation are those things outside of yourself. So intrinsic is like inside yourself, your own needs, what you find enjoyable, what you want to do, what you might feel motivated to do yourself. Extrinsic is actually a really good example of this, and sorry I keep using this as an example. It's because during this course my child's been potty training, so it's a really relevant topic on my mind. So intrinsic motivation would be like my child is pretty sick of wearing a diaper. He finds them uncomfortable, they're baggy, he just doesn't like wearing them, so he doesn't want to wear them. So because he's not wearing a diaper, he has to potty in the potty. Versus extrinsic motivation would be something like he's only pottying in the potty because we're giving him a gummy worm or some chocolate after he does it. That is an extrinsic motivation. It's coming from outside of him. It's an incentive. You could think of positive or negative reinforcement as being an extrinsic motivation. So these can motivate. They can change behavior and affect behavior, right? But the intrinsic motivation tends to lead to better, more long-lasting change in lots of different domains. So another interesting question is, think for yourself, does extrinsic motivation undermine intrinsic motivation? So let's take the potty training example again. Let's say my son just starts deciding that he only wants to potty because he's getting a chocolate bar. Once he stops getting chocolate bars, maybe we run out and we haven't gone to the store for more chocolate bars. Will he then decide, even though right now he's intrinsically motivated, will he then decide that he's only extrinsically motivated and only want to potty because of the extrinsic motivation and there's no chocolate bars, so he stops? That can happen. We've seen that in studies of people who are doing specific tasks like playing music or doing any kind of activity. They might be intrinsically motivated, they might enjoy that activity, then you give them some kind of reward for that, especially in childhood. That extrinsic motivation can undermine the intrinsic motivation. And there's levels of that. Like there's a certain amount of extrinsic motivation that's probably acceptable. Then if you go overboard, it might undermine the intrinsic motivation and they're no longer intrinsically motivated. So definitely some good research to look up there. Intrinsic motivation is the good thing to kind of focus on for a lot of human behavior, for us to set our own goals and try to do things that we like and want to do. So a big part of this is self-regulation. So that's just basically the process by which any kind of organism can control their behavior and pursue objectives, so pursue their own goals. So setting goals, planning to reach those goals, and then monitoring progress towards those goals is an important component. So a goal I had is to record this lecture, right? So for that goal, I had to plan to implement that. I had to plan, well, I had to look over the videos. I did check over the videos, and they had better audio earlier today. So I had to plan, and I had to take steps in that plan. Check the videos, check the slides, update the slides with new information from newer research, make sure they're saved in the appropriate format. And then, so I monitored my progress towards this goal of recording a lecture. This is relevant for other goals too, like finishing a degree, your associate's degree, your bachelor's degree, your master's degree, your PhD, getting a job. So you've got to set goals there. So that's self-regulation, that whole process. So effective goal setting is when specific goals are the best. So you want to, well, we've got exercise here. Maybe you have a New Year's resolution to work out more. Having a specific goal is better. I want to work out 3 days a week is better than saying I want to work out more. So setting a goal to work 3 days a week, or maybe setting a goal, well, with my work schedule, I can work Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. So setting that as your goal. Making it moderately challenging is good. You don't want it to be too challenging, or you might start to lose motivation because you get a little disappointed when you can't reach some of those goals. So make it moderately challenging, but not too high of a challenge. And then a long-term purpose behind those goals is really useful too. So for each of these things, adding more of these pieces of effective goal setting makes it better. So if there's a long-term purpose to your goal of working out, you have the New Year's resolution to work out, you make specific goals. I'm going to work out 3 days a week. You do maybe even just a moderately challenging workout program. And then your long-term purpose is, well, I want to be healthier because I know I have these health risks or something like that. Or some kind of long-term, really relevant purpose, something really meaningful to you. Short-term accomplishments are really good too. So tracking progress, so keeping a weight tracking sheet or marking down the days when you've actually done it, giving yourself an extrinsic reward for reaching like 6 days of working out. Probably don't want it to be chocolate if you're trying to get healthier or something like that. But giving yourself a small vacation, going to a park or something like that could be really good. Or going on a hike for one of your 6th workout day might be a fun thing. So those are all important for effective goal setting. So this I found out earlier today. This is a website for some of the activities that we created with a group at Claremont Graduate University to help young people find their purpose. This specific one is the Best Possible Selves activity. Essentially, right now this link is broken. I found that out earlier today, but I haven't been able to fix it yet. So you can't actually click it. Well, by the time you watch this, depending on what semester or year it is, right now, right when I'm recording this link does not work. Essentially what the Best Possible Self asks is, it prompts you, it says, hey, imagine your best possible self 30 years from now. The best possible version of who you are. What are you doing? Who's with you? Where are you? What are important things to your life now? What are some goals that you've reached? So, and also there's an aspect of it. And if you could have a magic wand, what would you change in the world? What would be different at this time 30 years from now? So that is a really good example of a self-regulation activity. Just sitting down, thinking about that, writing that down. And actually for these activities, we continued on with that self-regulation for more planning. So that's your kind of grand idea for 30 years from now. Even the world might be changed very differently. And we do step by step. What do you have to do in the next 10 years to get to that point? What do you have to do in the next 5 years is another prompt. What are the day-to-day activities that you're doing that will help you get to that point? So tying those long-term purposeful goals to things today helps a lot with that self-regulation. So that's what these activities are about. Hopefully I get that fixed quickly. Since it's a whole team, I'm not the one that actually has the access to the original website creator thing. So I couldn't just do it on my own, which was too bad. All right, so let's move on to emotions. So emotions are a feeling or affect, and it involves both a conscious experience as well as a physiological arousal. And so we'll talk about a couple different emotions in specifics, but there's those couple pieces to the emotion: the feeling, so the experience, the conscious or cognitive experience, as well as a physiological arousal from it. So, as an example, when I just felt fear a minute ago, when my cat jumped up and attacked my hand, my conscious experience was the kind of a terror or stress or anxiety of like, what is attacking my hand right now? And the physiological response was a little bit more sweating, my heart was beating faster, so that is also part of that emotion. So, make sure. Alright, so part of this is done by the autonomic nervous system. So there's the sympathetic nervous system that arouses and the parasympathetic nervous system that helps to calm. So here we've got sympathetic nervous system over here, leading to increased blood flow to the brain, dilating eyes, increases perspiration, and then the parasympathetic nervous system does a lot of decreasing of these things. And both of these are pieces of the autonomic nervous system. So how do we measure arousal in people when we're trying to measure emotions? One way that we do it is skin conductance level, so SCL response. So essentially, is your skin conducting more electricity? And it would be doing that if there is more sweat. So if there is a rise in the electrical conductivity, that is probably because you have more sweat gland activity. So sweaty palms conduct that electricity better than dry. And it's used in a lot of different studies of emotion. So looking at the skin conductance level for studies of love or fear or happiness or anything. So it's an easy way to get a measure to get the conductivity of skin, and so it's something that can be used widely across a lot of different emotional studies. Pretty cheap and easy to do too. So rather than something like an MRI is very costly and harder to do. So hormone levels can be tested as well. Hormone levels can be tested through blood tests. As we talked about though, hormones take a little bit to build up in your body. But blood tests as well as cheek skin samples can be used to see the hormone levels when certain things were happening. So for example, you might show people a video of people doing a pro-social action. And then 5 minutes into the video, you take a blood sample or you get a cheek swab, and then you compare the hormone levels then to their hormone levels before the video. And you might see more oxytocin, the love chemical, or things like that. So that's another physiological measure that is often done. So polygraph is something that was used a lot. It can detect things like heart rate, breathing, and skin conductance level. So with this, you would ask someone neutral questions and then target questions as well. So neutral questions that they shouldn't be, say, lying about, or they shouldn't be responding emotionally to, whether positively or negatively, and then the target questions that might make them respond emotionally. So with this, the results of polygraphs actually do not reliably detect deception, so they shouldn't be used in court cases anymore. There's been multiple court cases where essentially I'm not a lawyer. Essentially, the precedent now is do not use polygraph results in court cases at all because they are so unreliable. So there's also the Employee Polygraph Protection Act. Employees shouldn't be polygraphed by their employers. fMRIs might actually do a better job of detecting deception, but I would be very surprised maybe in the future if fMRIs become cheaper. But I mean, we give police officers tanks, so why not give them an MRI machine as well? Might better detect deception than polygraphs. But again, an fMRI is going to be a harder thing to take to test a large sample with. So doing things like skin conductance level is more common when we're looking for a physical measure of arousal or a physiological measure of arousal when we're researching emotions. I did have this open, but then I closed it because everything was going a little slow. All my goal setting and preparation dashed by
a lack of, and by having an integrated graphics card and not enough RAM. Alright, so let's look at these theories of emotion. These were talked about in your book, but this is a really good visual with some really funny and useful examples. And specifically, it's talking a lot about fear, anger, things like that. So we'll use these examples and talk about the couple different popular theories about how emotion and the physiological response and the cognitive response happens. And we'll go back to my cat example in a minute too.
Emotions are a tricky subject, both in life and in psychology. Questions like, why do you make me feel this way, are not only confusing on a personal level, but also on a scientific level. First, let's distinguish emotions from feelings and moods. An emotion is an immediate, specific, positive or negative response to internal thoughts or external environmental events. A feeling is the subjective experience of an emotion. It's what we refer to when we say things like, I feel angry, or I feel happy. A mood, meanwhile, is a diffuse, longer-lasting emotional state that doesn't necessarily have an identifiable object or trigger. So if something frustrating happens to you, you might immediately feel the emotional response of anger, and for the next few days you might be in a bad mood. Let's move on to the various components of an emotion. So we know that emotions are immediate and specific responses. These responses have at least three parts: physiological, cognitive, and behavioral. A physiological component of an emotion might be bodily arousal, like a racing heart or tense muscles. The cognitive component of an emotion is the subjective conscious experience of emotion. And the behavioral component of an emotion is the characteristic overt expressions of the emotion. Behaviors that other people can read, like particular facial expressions or postures. Charles Darwin studied this third component of emotions in his 1872 book, The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals, in which he argued that particular emotional responses tend to accompany the same emotional states in all members of a species. So, according to Darwin's argument, all of the members of a species will display the same behavior when they feel a particular emotion. All cats will display the same behavior when they are happy. And all humans will have the same facial expression and behavior when scared. With this evidence, Darwin suggested that the expression of emotion is genetically determined. This behavior has evolved and has been passed down through generations in our genes. Now let's look at some theories of how emotions work. Let's start with the common sense view. In this view, a stimulus prompts an emotion, which in turn prompts some bodily arousal. So in this case, a frightening spectacle fills our villain with fear, which makes him sweat and makes his heart rate rise. In the mid-1880s, two scholars, William James and Carl Lang, independently came up with similar theories that contradicted this common sense view. James and Lang both suggested that instead of emotions causing bodily arousal causes emotions. So to return to our previous example, that would mean that the sight of the hero on his threshold makes our villain's heart beat faster, his hands tremble, and his palms sweat, and these physiological changes cause him to feel fear. But this theory is vulnerable to a few criticisms. First, it is possible to have physiological arousal without any accompanied emotion. For instance, your palms might sweat because it's hot, but that sweat won't make you feel nervous, just kind of gross. Second, physiological changes can be too slow to precede the conscious experience of emotion. Our villain might feel scared as soon as he sees our hero, but it might take a few seconds for him to start sweating. Third, the same set of physiological responses are associated with very different emotional experiences. A faster heart rate could mean fear, but it could also mean anger, or surprise, or joy. Finally, there is evidence that physiological feedback is not necessary for emotion. For example, patients with spinal cord injuries who have lost most of their physiological feedback still experience the same emotions as before. However, in the James Lang theory's favor, there is notably some slight evidence of dissipation in their emotional reactions. As an alternative to the James Lang theory, two other theorists, Walter Cannon and Philip Bard, propose that the physiological arousal of emotions and the experience of emotions are entirely separate processes. That is, a stimulus causes the emotion and physiological arousal independently. Neither one causes the other. So the sight of our hero causes our villain both to feel fear and for his palms to sweat and heart to race. But contrary to this theory, there have been many reports of physiological stimuli influencing emotions. So it's unlikely that physiology and emotions are completely disconnected. One suggestion of how arousal and the experience of emotion may be connected but not causal was proposed in the 1960s by Stanley Schachter and Jerome Singer as the Schachter-Singer two-factor theory, which introduces the factor of cognition. The theory suggests that when a stimulus elicits some arousal, this arousal elicits some cognition, which interprets the source of the arousal, and then this interpretation then elicits the experience of emotion. From the stimulus, it takes two different factors, the arousal and the cognition, to elicit the emotion, hence the name Schachter-Singer two-factor theory. For example, say that you feel your face start to flush. According to this theory, you'll automatically use cues from your environment to help explain this flush. You might be mid-workout, or someone might have just confessed their love to you. Although the arousal is the same, the cognitive evaluation of the stimulus is very different across these two scenarios. And so the emotions you would feel would also be very different. Say, pride versus shyness, for instance. To return to our previous example, if the sight of our hero makes our villain's heart beat faster, then their cognitive evaluation of the situation, say remembering that the hero is a Secret Service agent here to save the world, or that he is their long-lost love from primary school, will determine their emotional response to the situation. Again, with this theory, it's about the interpretation of the stimuli and the arousal, which leads to the emotion. So let's just quickly review these four theories of emotion to help you remember them. First, the common sense view is that a stimulus will cause an emotion, which causes arousal. Second, the James Lang theory reverses emotion and arousal, suggesting instead that a stimulus causes arousal, which then causes emotion. Third, the Cannon-Bard theory separates out emotion and arousal as independent reactions to the stimulus. And finally, the Schachter-Singer two-factor theory adds another factor to the cause of emotion. After a stimulus elicits some arousal, you cognitively assess the stimulus, and that assessment causes the emotion.
So those examples, I think, are really clear. And the villain in the lair and the fear or anger they might feel is really relevant. So maybe go over your notes on these theories in your book. Use these examples to remind you about it. So we'll go over them again really quickly. So James Lang theory, you perceive an external stimulus, a fuzzy, scratchy paw on your hand. So you have a physiological arousal, so heart starts beating faster, sweating a little more, so I perceive those physiological changes, and now I feel fear that my cat is trying to attack me. The Cannon-Bard theory, you perceive that stimulus, and at the same time you have the physiological arousal as well as the emotion. At the same time, they're independent in this theory, although as it talked about in the video, we do see evidence of physiological responses affecting emotion. One example that we'll talk about in a minute is if you smile intentionally, so do a fake smile. That looked really creepy, watching myself do that on the camera. There's a real smile. So if you try to smile, if you fake it, you can actually make yourself feel a little bit more happy. So in a funny study, I don't actually have a pencil right here with me, they had participants put a pencil in their mouth, and it does some of the work of a smile. Like your smile pulls the corners of your mouth back, it engages these muscles are in a different position. So the thought was, well, hey, if that physiological response is there, the muscles are back, the cheeks are back, it might suggest to your brain, send some of the that neural network that helps you feel happy might be partially activated. turns out that was true. People who were reporting their happiness level when they had the pencil in their mouth, they did tend to report a little bit more happiness. So again, Cannon-Bard theory, the physiological arousal and the emotion are happening at the same time and are independent. So the two-factor theory was that there's the external stimulus, and then we interpret the physiological cues that we're getting based on what's happening in the environment. We label it, so, oh, something is attacking my hand right now, and now I feel an emotion. So that is the two-factor theory. So with this, dopamine and endorphins tend to be highly related with positive emotions, joy, things like that. Norepinephrine has a lot of, as we've discussed before, all of these neurotransmitters do a lot of different things, but these are some that are highly involved in these specific processes. So norepinephrine helps regulate arousal and anxiety. Serotonin is related to aggression and anger. When you have low serotonin, higher likelihood of being aggressive, angry, and have a negative mood. So the limbic system with the amygdala is really important in a lot of these different emotions, and especially with fear. Fear is one of those that's studied a lot. Maybe because it's easier to induce fear. Just watch a scary movie. You might get scared. Or have a cat jump and attack your hand. You might get scared. Although you probably can't train a cat very well to have the cat attack random participants' hands. So with this, you've got an indirect route where you go thalamus to the sensory cortex to the amygdala, and this helps you gain memories. So going through this kind of system, that neural network of these parts of the brain being active, when you see a snake or have an interaction, someone jumps out from behind a corner, that emotional memory will be a little bit stronger because of these processes going on. So emotion is that feeling or affect. It can involve that physiological arousal, that conscious experience, and it often also involves a behavioral expression, whether it's a facial expression, leaving, like running away from the scary thing, or coming closer to something that you care about. So the primacy debate is about what comes first, that feeling or the thinking about it. So Lazarus suggested that the cognitive piece is really important, that how we appraise things determines the feelings. So this would be like, something just happened, I feel a physiological response. What is happening? Oh, it's a cat attacking my hand, or something's attacking my hand. Versus Zoniak, I think that's how to pronounce the name, is that emotions are more important. That we have our specific preferences, whether we're happy or sad or afraid, and we don't need to cognitively think about it, that these emotions kind of happen on their own. So behavioral factors, we might have verbal reactions to emotions, we might have nonverbal reactions. A lot of times these nonverbal reactions like posture, gestures, facial expressions are some that are looked at in more detail. I'm thinking right now of the show Lie to Me, where they're using like micro expressions to try and see how people are feeling if they're actually lying. A lot of the research actually shows that while some people on average might show some micro expressions, even if they're trying to like conceal their behaviors, that it's essentially not much better than pseudoscience. There's not very good predictive value of those ideas, but it was an interesting enough show. I watched for a season, I think. Anyway, facial feedback hypothesis is that facial expressions can influence emotions. This is what I was talking about in the example of the people who had a pencil that they put in their mouth that stretched their cheeks back, and they actually reported a little higher happiness. You could actually do this. I don't remember if this study's been done. It probably has. Maybe look for it and put it in a question paper. You could also do that and then test someone's hormone levels, see if they are higher in, say, dopamine. So this does support the James Lange theory of emotion, that the physiological response might be part of that emotional response. Seems likely it's probably can be completely cognitive, could be completely the physiological response too. So with that, identifying emotions. Can you identify these emotions? I mean, most likely these are actors trying to portray an emotion, but what would you say these are? Maybe take a minute to kind of identify these emotions, write down on your notes what these are. We'll see if you're right. All right, so the places I got these from, I searched for like happiness, anger, sadness, surprise, disgust, and fear. So whether or not these actors are doing a good or a bad job of displaying those, I think they were some of the best ones that I could find, honestly. So with this, interestingly, across cultures around the world, the expressions that we make, the facial expressions, are really similar across different cultures. So expressions of happiness, expressions of disgust, expressions of fear, expressions of anger, the way our faces move for these emotions is really consistent across cultures. So perhaps there's some genetic component to that we've learned social behavior and it's been ingrained to us evolutionarily. Display rules do vary across cultures. So when is it appropriate to show your anger? Like, is it appropriate to show your anger in front of your boss who's being rude to you? Or is it not appropriate to show your anger then? So that's what we're talking about, display rules. When is it appropriate to display that emotion? But the actual facial expressions do seem to be pretty consistent across cultures. Interestingly, this is really kind of a tangent. Maybe I shouldn't even mention it, but now I've already kind of gone off on the tangent. Apes, chimps specifically, the baring of their teeth, so like showing their teeth, it looks like a smile. People, I see sometimes like Reddit videos or YouTube videos about a chimp that looks like it's smiling. Interestingly, that's actually generally them being angry and like showing their teeth to like scare off something that they are threatened by. So it looks similar to a human smile in some ways, just on a chimp's face, but actually it's them like trying to be like, get away from me or I'm gonna bite you, or like fight you generally. I don't actually know if they bite very much. I haven't learned very much about chimp psychology in my graduate programs. Probably could do a question paper on that too. All right, so as we classify emotions, one of the things that we look at is it a positive or a negative affect? So are we generally feeling positive? Are we generally feeling negative? And what is our arousal level? Are we really highly aroused or are we not aroused at all? So as an example, so we've got, is it positive or negative here in the columns, then highly arousing on the top row, and then not very arousing on the bottom. So something that would be positive and highly arousing would be a feeling of ecstasy. So you feel just really fantastic, super great ecstasy, versus still on that positive side, but on a low arousal level, so not as intense, would be contentment. I'm content. I feel generally good, just fine, but like a lower level of intensity. Similarly, for a negative emotion, high would be fury. So rage and fury, or really upset, really mad. You want to be like a chimp and like bar your teeth at someone. Or on the low end, a generally negative kind of emotion, but at a low intensity might be boredom. So, yeah. So what are the adaptive functions of emotions? There are adaptive functions of negative emotions. We evolved to be able to have emotions for specific reasons. Most emotions, this is why it's in the motivation and emotion chapter, most emotions do motivate us to do things. So negative emotions generally motivate us to take corrective action, to fix something or change something, get away from something. So positive emotions also have motivating features to them. And one of the interesting pieces of research is the broaden and build model. We'll watch this video on it. It's a really core component of positive psychology that I actually have a bunch of slides on positive psychology, but generally in this Unit 4 slideshow, generally in my classes, I don't get all the way through to all those positive all that positive psych material. So I'll see at the end of this lecture how long it's been. Then I might even go into some positive psych today. But positive emotions can have a broadening and building response in human motivation and emotions and experiences across various contexts. So let's learn about that.
The jump for joy positive emotions can seem kind of trivial, out of place, maybe irrelevant. And what I want to argue is that that's really, nothing could be further from the case. There are a whole range of positive emotions, including, that feeling in our bones grateful for our current circumstances, completely in tune with our environment, at one, at peace, feeling serene and tranquil and savoring that. Sharing laughter with a close loved one or friend and the lightness of that moment. Being inspired by great leaders. These are all important positive emotions that are really quite relevant, especially when we're facing difficult times. Feeling the love and closeness of people we care for. Now, all of these different positive emotions and more share in common two core truths. There are two core truths about these positive emotions. One is that they open us. They literally change the boundaries of our minds and our hearts and change our outlook on our environments. Now, let me get poetic here for just a moment. Imagine that you're this water lily. It's early dawn and your petals are closed in around your face. If you can see out at all from that vantage point, it's just a little spot of sunlight, okay? But as the sun rises in the sky, things begin to change, and your delicate blinders around your face begin to open, and your world quite literally expands. You can see more. Your world is larger, okay? Now, sunlight is what changes the openness of flowers like this. The openness of our minds and hearts obey the warmth of positivity, the warmth of positive emotions, changes how open our visual perspective is at a really basic level, and our ability to see our common humanity with others. And we know this because we've done randomized controlled studies where we induce positive emotions by the flip of a coin. Some people are either given a dose of positive experiences, cute puppies, goofy penguins, beautiful sunsets, or neutral pictures, chairs, light switches, things like that. Other studies use a very simple paradigm that was developed by Alice Eisen decades ago, where you give people a gift of candy, all wrapped up in cellophane, so you know it's not a sugar high that's creating but it's a gift, a token. They're either given the gift before the experiment starts or after it's over. In other studies, they have people listen to pleasant music. Now, in these kinds of studies, we know that it changes the way people view, can kind of step back and take in the big picture. Here's a study from my own lab where we gave people a series of tests like this where we showed a comparison figure, a target figure on top, and then asked which of these two comparison figures most resembles this. Now, there's no right or wrong answer. They each resemble it a little bit, but this one resembles it in its global configuration, this one more in its local detail elements. And what we know is that if you inject positive emotions, people are more likely to step back and see the big picture and see the similarities along those lines. Other work on this opening or broadening effect has used eye tracking, where they lock in a camera on the iris and see what people are looking at. And if you give people that little gift of candy before they do a study like this, they're more likely to look around all the different aspects of a complicated array. If you don't give people a gift of candy, they pretty much just look at the center baby and they don't look at the babies on the side. So we know that positive emotions widen the scope of what people are scanning for in the environment. Rumi wrote about this in the 13th century. and captured this aspect of what positive emotions can do. He wrote, "There is a way of breathing that's a shame and a suffocation." It really narrows us down. There's another way of expiring, a love breath, he called it, that lets us open infinitely. Okay, so we have dozens of studies now that show us that this isn't just poetic language. Now, our studies don't underscore the infinitely part. That part may take a few more years to get us to that level. But we do know that positive emotions open our awareness. They increase the expanse of our peripheral vision. We see more. And there are a lot of places where this matters. Because we see more possibilities. People come up with more ideas about what they might do next when they're experiencing a positive emotion relative to when they're experiencing neutral states or negative emotions. People are more creative. Some of the earliest work in this area showed how tests of creativity that used to be used for graduate admissions, that if you give people a bag of candy before they complete those tests, they score higher on them. Okay, they're no longer used for graduate admissions. But people are more creative, and this widening of awareness has been directly linked to this greater creativity. People are more likely to be resilient. I have a whole line of research on resilience where we've shown that people are able to bounce back quicker from adversity when they're experiencing positive emotions. Some other research has shown that kids do better on a math test or in a learning context if they're just asked to sit and think of a positive memory before they take the test. So there's better academic performance. Really neat work on physicians making better medical decisions, better at integrating the complex information of an unsolved case when they're given a bag of candy, a really small positive emotion induction. So maybe you should go to your doctor's office with that bag of candy. One of the studies that one of my former students, Kareem Johnson, and I did together looked at how positive emotions allow us to look past racial and cultural differences and see the unique individual and recognize individuals across racial lines, to see past difference and to see towards oneness. There are other experiments that show if you induce positive emotions, people are more trusting. People come to better win-win solutions in negotiations, all kinds of effects. And I want to just emphasize that this isn't the same story that we've known for decades, that positive emotions help us see the world through rose-colored glasses or see the glasses half full rather than half empty. I'm not saying that these views are wrong, but it's not the whole story. In addition, we're also seeing the big picture. At a very fundamental level, we're able to see larger systems, see larger forms of interconnection when we're experiencing positive emotions, and that can make a huge difference when we're trying to address some of these really entangled societal problems that we face.
So Greater Good Science Center is a pretty good place to find positive psychology research. And they do a fair job at like putting it down to a level where someone at college level will understand. Not sure if it's good enough for, if it's like to a level and explain it in a way that maybe an adolescent would understand. But I think they do a fair job. So with that, the broaden and build model is essentially, she focused a lot about that your perspective is going to be different, that you will literally sense and perceive more in an environment when you have a positive emotion. So that's a part of it, but that's just kind of the start of it. It's the broaden and build model is that with positive emotions, you're going to essentially have the possibility of starting a positive upward spiral. That as you are broadening, you see more opportunities, more creative, you have a chance to have even more positive emotions, more creativity. So in changing your context, solving problems, things like that. So positive emotions can have a lot of positive adaptive functions to them. They can motivate you as well to do other positive things, be more pro-social, help other people around you, be more resilient. So resilience is, she mentioned it really briefly, being able to bounce back from challenges, hard times, traumas, things like that. Giving you more positive outlet, leading you to more emotional wisdom. So, happiness specifically. It seems that our set point for happiness, so we talked earlier about set point for genetics and your body fat content level. It seems like a lot of our set point for our happiness level is genetic. So about 50 to 80% might be inherited. So that means that a large portion of how happy you are just on average, just generally, is probably genetic. Not all of it, but a big amount of it. So there are some obstacles to happiness. One is the hedonic treadmill, that individual pleasures, so enjoying something like a piece of cake or playing a video game or something fun that you're doing might be short-lived. And so you get that extra joy or positive emotion during that time, but then you come back to that set point. Also, depending on what you're doing, you might be doing something that you really enjoy. You're going to work in a new job that you really enjoy for the first couple months. You're on this really big high of positive emotions, but you kind of get back, your set point gets reset to that point. So direct pursuit of happiness can backfire. Just trying to do things that are pleasurable can backfire and lead to your set point being different. So striving for goals tends to lead to more happiness, to more positive emotions. You have things like self-efficacy that you gain as you're reaching those goals, as you see yourself making changes to get to those goals. Things that you're doing, being altruistic, trying to be altruistic, doing good things for others tends to lead people to have a lot more positive emotions. Physical activity, so exercise, whether it be just walking. This is also relevant to our discussion on treatments of depression, for example. So physical activity is really highly related to things like dopamine and serotonin levels in the brain. Positive self-reflection, so thinking back to your identity and things that are positive about you. And a personally meaningful goal investment. So let's break that down a little bit. So goal investment is, well, you've got a long-term goal, and it should be personally meaningful to you. So that goal to work out every day or 3 days a week, that should be personally meaningful to you. It should be really relevant, something that's important to you, rather than just something that your friend is doing, so you want to do it with your friend. That can be doing something for your friend. That can be meaningful too. So the more meaningful that goal is, the more long-term it is, the more often it is to give you a sense of happiness and positive emotion, positive valenced emotions as you strive for it. Gratitude exercises show a lot of results for giving people positive emotions. So one really common way to induce gratitude is to ask participants to write gratitude letters. Whether it's 1 or 3, to write some letters saying you're grateful to someone. You can either send them or not send them. You get about the same boost of gratitude and happiness and positive emotions whether you send them or not. A little more when you actually do send the letters. But you still get a pretty high boost of positive emotions even if you don't send them and you're just writing them. Physical exercise, like I mentioned, is one of the really consistent things that shows that it's related to positive emotions. So with that, how long has this lecture been so far? Yeah, let's go through a couple points in positive psychology, especially since this is really related to positive psychology. So the reason why I want to go over this and positive psychology is because I am a positive developmental psychologist. So my program is in positive psychology and developmental psychology. So let's go over a couple key pieces of positive psychology. Positive psychology, you might not be surprised knowing how I've talked about humanistic psychology, kind of grew out of humanistic psychology. So humanistic psychology, positive psychologists didn't feel like humanistic psychologists were doing a good enough job doing a good analysis of things like positive characteristics of people. There was a lot of qualitative research. Positive psychologists felt there should be more quantitative research. There's a lot more overlap, I'd say, now than when these fields kind of diverged. But with that, it's been around since the early 2000s, essentially. So with that, positive psychology focuses on the positive aspects of human experience, positive emotions. It looks at, well, here are the pillars of positive psychology. Positive individual experiences. So this would be positive emotion. So feeling happiness is a positive individual experience. So other positive individual experiences might be feeling gratitude or experiencing gratitude, experiencing purpose. Positive traits are things like characteristics. You can think of personality traits here. So positive characteristics, you might be a helpful person. That might be a positive trait. You might be a courageous person. That might be a positive trait. When we talked about personality traits, I gave the character strengths survey as an option that you could do like outside of class. All of those are positive traits. So it's kind of a positive personality aspects, those character strengths. Wisdom, for example. Positive institutions is that positive psychology also focuses on the institutions we live in, schools, government, communities. What can we do to make these positive institutions do more for people in a more positive way, help people have more positive individual experience, build positive traits in people? As an example, positive institutions like schools with positive school climate lead to more academic achievement, lead to fewer risk factors for students, for adolescent sexual behaviors, for example. So these are the pillars of positive psychology, those individual experiences. And there's I would say more research early in the beginning of the field was focused on those individual experiences. More research started being built around positive traits. And still, I feel like that research on the positive institutions is still trying to catch up to those two areas of these pillars. That's my own personal subjective judgment. I haven't done like an analysis and checked like keywords of articles and counted them up and things. So positive individual experiences, emotions, studies of contentment. Generally, these are short-term pleasant experiences that are being investigated. So hedonic well-being is that pleasure and happiness that you might get from, say, eating a snow cone or something like. Eudaimonic well-being is, you could say, that self-actualization. You're realizing your own human potential. So that's eudaimonic well-being. Really brief summary there. So positive traits are these character strengths. So courage, compassion, resilience, wisdom, humanity. So here are those surveys again for the VIA character strengths. Feel free to do those. You can use those kind of strengths like humanity strengths, kindness, self-control, wisdom to overcome challenges, to be more resilient, to accomplish your goal, to be engaged in life. So this is a lot of the work I do is kind of focused on fostering these positive characteristics of people. So fostering purpose, helping people build their self-control, helping people build their courage or their compassion, their empathy, their resilience. So a lot of what I do is applied to this area, is increasing positive traits so that people can use them to improve theirs and other people's lives. So this is more related to the eudaimonic well-being, so that long-term, like becoming the person you want to be kind of well-being. And then positive institutions, groups, clubs, families. Families can also be a positive institution and hopefully are a positive institution. So the investigation of positive institutions goes all the way from that, like these small groups, to big groups like a government, and how does a government operate and work. So the broaden and build discussion from that video that we just watched talked about how doctors sometimes make better decisions or can think more outside the box when they are having positive emotions. That's an example of something that you would do and try to implement into a hospital setting, so there are more positive emotions, so there are more better decisions being made. So there is a lot of research in schools and families, probably because it's just easier to access those populations. There's not as much research. There is research and evaluation into clubs and groups like Girl Scouts or governments, both city, community, county, and federal level, and worldwide as well, evaluations of these. But most of the research on positive institutions is in schools and families. So Easy to find that. So with this, positive institutions, one aspect and one reason that I am a positive developmental psychologist is because developmental psychology, trying to foster the development, the positive development of people, it is positive psychology. It takes into account these positive institutions, a family, the community. If you think of these models that we've talked about of development of people and their change through time, developmental psychology in reality really is positive psychology. So you could call it overlap, but honestly in a lot of ways they are the same thing. We want people to have the capacities to make their own goals, to do things well, to have a healthy life, to live a long life, to be beneficial to people around them, to feel love and self-actualization throughout their life. So developmental psychology, especially applied developmental science, is very synonymous with positive psychology. So they are very much the same, and that's why the degree I'm getting is positive developmental psychology. PYD, positive youth development, is a area of developmental psychology that really focuses on that positive development and building these skills, these character strengths in young people. So there are positive youth development applied programs that are implemented across, there's evaluations from a PYD perspective, so researching certain programs to see do they fit a positive youth development model. So PYD, or positive youth development, is a really kind of good keyword to kind of look for if you're looking for an adolescent program for young people. So this is another important aspect of well-being. Specifically, I'm trying to decide like how much of positive psych do I want to go into. So I could literally teach entire classes on it, just like with other aspects of this, but I'm trying to pack all of positives, not all, but pack some important key pieces of positive psych into 10 or 15 minutes. The PERMA model of well-being, I think, would be a good thing for people to remember going forward. So PERMA is just a nice acronym. So positive emotions, engagement, positive relationships, meaning, and accomplishments, all those things together equal well-being. So you need those positive emotions like happiness, but you also need to be engaged in things, like engaged in your work or hobbies, have positive relationships with people around you, have meaningful pursuits. So maybe the things that you're engaged with are meaningful. That would be the hope, kind of combining all these together, and then getting accomplishments in those areas. Maybe your work is meaningful to you, you're engaged in your work, you have positive relationships with your family and friends and the people around you at work, so you're getting these positive emotions. That's what we want to see, to have people have this eudaimonic well-being. So flow is a really useful thing. We've talked about stress and arousal. Flow, definitely watch this video if it's something that you're interested in. Flow is essentially the experience of being so deeply engrossed in some activity that at the same time you feel like time is going really quickly, but also very slowly. Like you've finished the task and you're like, oh my goodness, where did the time go? I've now been doing this for a couple hours. But in the moment it feels like it's going for a long time, that you're really involved and engaged and engrossed. Big key of this is to match your arousal level with your skill level. So, for example, if you are trying to learn to drive a car for the first time, your challenge level is probably going to be very, very high, and your skill level will be very, very low. So you might be anxious or worried about it when you're first learning to drive a car. If you've been driving a car for a couple of years, your challenge level, just in general day-to-day driving, is probably pretty low. It's probably not very challenging to just drive the car to work or the store, and your skill level is probably fairly high, so you might be bored while driving the car. If you say have been driving a couple of years, but you want to take that car to a racetrack, and maybe you even have a driving instructor that can give you feedback as you're learning to like go around the racetrack, you might have a challenge level that's high enough and meeting your skill level, so hopefully you would be in that state of flow. So you're feeling engaged, you're feeling engrossed in the activity, you're being challenged at the appropriate level for you, So that's the experience of flow. I often feel flow when I'm in the process of, say, writing or working on something new. So as I get really engaged and engrossed in it, I will just, even with ADHD, I'll be able to focus on it and just power through and be enjoying the experience of working on this thing, whether it's writing or prepping things for students, something like that. And then after it's done, I might realize, oh my goodness, it's 3 a.m. Where did all these hours go? But the experience itself was really engaging and enjoying because I was matching my challenge level with my skill level. Another example is video games. So if you play multiplayer online video games, you'll oftentimes be up against opponents, opposing teams at a different skill level than you. Interestingly, most companies will try to have their servers essentially match you with the skill level of opponents that is about the same, either a little higher than your skill level or a little lower than your skill level. You might have found, if you're playing, say, an older game or a game that not a lot of other people are playing, that you might be going up against people that are a lot higher skill than you. And when you're going up in team, say, I used to play Halo online. Don't really have time for it now, but hopefully someday again. I used to play Halo online with people, and so when I would get a lot of matches over and over again with people that were a lot higher skill than me, I would get really frustrated. I would get more anxious because the challenge level was just too high and my skill level was too low. Versus if I was playing against players who were not as skilled as me, just over and over and over again, it was too easy, I would just get bored. So where a lot of video game companies will try to match you up is right around your own skill level. So that's why they have things like ranking, they have their own systems on the back end to try and put you together with people around your own challenge so that you keep playing, so that you're engaged, you're in a flow state. So if you play video games like that, you might have experienced flow in that kind of situation. I also experienced flow like riding my motorcycle. Daily riding now doesn't really do that, but going out on like a canyon ride, probably the next step for me to reach this flow for motorcycle riding would be at a racetrack, because the challenge, I don't want to get to that challenge level on the street because that's just probably not a very safe idea when I'm trying to challenge myself at that, trying to peak out my skill level at the same time. So racetrack's probably where I want to do that. So there's a couple examples. Definitely watch that video. Positive relationships is a really important piece of positive psychology. Essentially, one of the biggest keys in positive psychology is that other people matter. It's one thing that Chris Peterson used to say a lot, is that other people matter. So building those positive relationships with people is one of the biggest things that's going to give you well-being, give you that broadening and building experience, increase your opportunity to use your positive characteristics, things like that. Families, relationships as well. One of the most common purposes that people have is actually towards their family. So towards caring for, building, providing for their family. So with that, these are all aspects of PYD. I think the little summary I gave was good enough for what we have here. So this is, I think, a really interesting finding, and this is something that's been repeated many times since this time in 1996. As long as you're above the poverty line, additional wealth is very weakly correlated with happiness across cultures. So no matter where you are in the world, if you have your needs met, it doesn't matter at that point. At that point, money does not buy happiness. This is essentially what the finding is, that you need to have your needs met, but after your needs are met, money doesn't buy happiness. Obviously, if you are in poverty, that's a huge risk factor for a lot of different problems. And so the chances of being happy, it's a little harder, it's a lot more of a struggle, you need more resilience, things like that. But after the poverty line, money does not buy happiness. Gratitude activities are one of the most popular positive psychology interventions, like the applications of positive psychology. So doing things that show your gratitude or make you feel grateful are one of the biggest impacts or quickest, easiest to research impacts on your positive emotions. Can increase physical health, optimism, even pro-social behavior. So this is one thing that I think is really important as a person who's really interested in human development. Healthy human development can take place under any kinds of conditions. So even conditions of really great adversity. So even people who are in poverty, who have trauma, who have PTSD, who have disabilities, who have any kind of risk factors you can think of, they can still have healthy and positive human development with resilience. So if you help them increase their resilience, if you give them supports, people can improve and do better and be healthy and have well-being, which I think is really inspiring. It's really motivating to me to think, well, yes, a person might have 20 risk factors, but that doesn't preclude them from developing more optimally. So we can still do things, we can still intervene, we can still help people do better. And it just makes me feel inspired to do more to help people, honestly. So another thing is minding in a relationship is really helpful. So minding is essentially the idea that when you're in a relationship with someone, when you're having a conversation with someone, if you are paying attention, if you are directed towards that person, if you have goals for that person, and towards that relationship, if you are paying attention to it, minding, if you're being mindful about that relationship, if you're self-disclosing yourself, if you're putting effort in. I'm trying to use different words to try and get the idea by, but that's minding, and that is very good for building that positive relationships between people. So talking, communicating, trying to be present there, having goals together in that relationship. That goes with relationships with your children or your partner or with your best friends or with your family members. Minding those relationships is one of the biggest things. It sounds easy, but the aspects of doing minding, that's the hard part. So, what is psychology? Going back to one of the first topics that we covered in the class, it's the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. We have talked about a lot of behaviors, we have talked about a lot of mental processes just today, as well as throughout this course. So this is the scientific study trying to get good, clear research methods, good, clear data, good, clear theories that we can make good, clear hypotheses from, that we can do good, clear studies to get good, clear data to explain, predict, and know what our behavior and mental processes are, what they're affected by. And for me, myself, positive developmental psychology, trying to help influence people to develop more optimally. So that's what psychology is. The scientific study of behavior and mental processes. We've gone over a lot of things in just today even, but we've really only scratched the surface to psychology. But I'm glad to share it with all of you.